A new series begins later in which Mr. T looks at stuff and says, "What's it all about, fool?" That's at midnight. Right now, it's the 80s Nostalgia podcast, and this week's guest is a puppeteer whose work includes Fraggle Rock, Labyrinth and Star Wars, Mr. Mike Quinn.
So you started performing when you were 8. You had a professional magic act, is that right?
Yeah. It was. I sort of had. At one point, it was sort of a two-part act where there'd be a bit of magic and then there'd be a puppet show. Sometimes I did them separately, a little puppet booth thing. But yeah, I was always interested in magic and magicians and the TV stuff and so yeah, I had some magic tricks that I would do. For other kids at park shows and auditions and a few parties here and there as well. Every once in a while I'd get paid to do it, very rarely, but I wasn't much good though.
How did you get into it and who inspired you?
As far as magic goes, it's interesting. It's growing up, just like with the puppet thing, it was something that was always there and always around and sort of made me think, question, how is this happening? And to me, it's interesting because I'd watch, I'm back in the day when I grew up, the main sort of British TV magician was David Nixon, and he would have a lot of guests on the show that would be like puppeteers like Sherry Lewis with Lamb Chop and Ray Allen and Lord Charles and things like that. So, but to me, it's funny because the magic that he did, I always thought was like real magic. And then the stuff that I was doing was pretend magic. Isn't that great? We need to believe in magic, though. We need to know there's more out there than what we're currently doing or using or accessing. And I think we do that when we, to a certain extent, when we watch Muppets and puppets and fantasy films and that kind of thing. We're sort of just stepping into that world of a different kind of belief, to think, okay, maybe this could possibly happen.
I was hugely into magic as well when I was young, and still am.
Yeah, me too.
It's amazing how you can create that sort of amazement in someone else.
Yeah, and to me, puppetry is exactly the same thing, though. You're creating this little piece of this illusion of life, essentially, with something that's inanimate, and people are totally buying into it and responding on an emotional level to these characters, whether it's something on television or a puppet that's being worked right in front of them. So it's sort of a little piece of magic, really, when you're working a puppet. Yeah.
And who did you create? What were the puppets called?
Oh, back then, they were actually little glove puppets that were bought. So that, one was kind of like a sooty, and there was a clown, and there was sort of little, just little glove puppets, essentially. And I wrote this little script. I don't even remember if they had names or not. I sort of taped up cardboard scenery to the little booth and wrote a little script myself. I don't think it made any sense at all. But the reason that I sort of wanted to go through this was so that at the end of the show they could get into a fight. And the puppets could give each other sort of pies in the face. I thought, hey, a bit of good physical slapstick comedy. And so I'd use these paper plates with shaving foam on them, and then they'd end up just sort of hitting each other with those in the face. And that was my big finish. So I never, I used to do talent shows for TV and stuff like that, auditions, I should say. But I never, of course, got anywhere. I never got on any of the shows, thankfully, because that would have been incredibly embarrassing.
Were you in many school plays or doing any performing arts groups?
Oh, that's a good question. People don't usually ask that. Not so much. There was one that I remember doing perhaps when I was about, let's see, what would I be? Maybe 11 or something. But it wasn't. It was more of a visual part, and I don't even understand what that was exactly. It was something weird. Something, again, when I was like a Christmas pageant thing when I was maybe 5 or 6. But just a few little bits and pieces, yeah. But not a whole lot, interestingly enough. My sister was usually more active in the entertainment side. She was 2 years older than me, and so she sang and played piano, and she played the tin whistle. And she did a lot more auditions and talent competitions, and appeared on the stage as a child actor as well. So so she was a lot more sort of visible as an entertainer, and I was sort of hiding in the shadows, basically.
And was it straight after school that you met Jim Henson?
I met him actually before then. I was about, I want to say maybe 13 or so in 1977. So I was about 13. I was still at school. And let's see, how did that work? The Muppet Show had just sort of hit big in 1976 in the UK, the very first season of Muppet Show. It was like huge at that point. And I don't think they had quite started season 2 yet, shooting it, or they were about to. But so the main guys were over, I think, getting ready for that, the main performers. And I used to listen to the Kenny Everett radio show on a Saturday lunchtime, which was on Capital Radio in London. And he announced that the following week they were going to have a studio full of cuddliness and all the Muppets were going to visit him and that kind of thing. So I thought, So my friend and I hopped on the bus and showed up at the lobby of Capital Radio a little bit before they arrived, and I actually got to meet the main 5 puppeteers, and they signed a picture that I had from the back of a Look-In magazine, the kids' TV magazine, and they all signed that for me. And then I met Kenny Everett at the end of the show as he came out with his satchel full of LPs. And so that was the first time I ever met them, actually. And they hadn't even done, I think, the Muppet movie at that point. So it was really literally after the first season of Muppet Show. And I think halfway down the stairs had just become number 3 in the charts, in the singles charts, which was Robin the Frog. Muppets were sort of really big at that point in time.
Is it true that you bribed a security guard to get in?
Yeah, that is pretty much what happened. I was 15, and so I'd sort of use the excuse of visiting the Muppet studio at ATV. I was living in Enfield, so I could get a bus ride essentially from door to door, really, which was great. But so at one point my dad was working for a company in London that supplied something to ATV Studios. It was a one-off thing, and my dad got to know this accountant that worked there. So that was how I initially got in to see the very first my very first Muppet Show taping. But after that, I sort of kept going on my own anyway, and so I would bring this accountant literally cigarettes and chocolates, and so that he would sort of get me in through the gate on it was about every other Wednesday or something, when they had guest stars, it was when they were filming. So I'm sure I wasn't really supposed to do that, and I'm sure he wasn't really supposed to accept gifts either from a minor. But however, that's how things worked, I guess, back in those days. You couldn't do it now, of course, things have changed so much. But it would get me into the studio regularly, and they got to know me, basically, which was a wonderful thing. So I'd watch each of the guest stars perform, and they would shoot one day a week. And then I think 2 or 3 other days a week was the rest of the Muppet Show. So they'd shoot one show a week. So, it was great.
So you got to visit the actual Muppet studio. What was that like? That sounds like a dream come true for people like me.
Well, it was for me, because I was like the ultimate Muppet fan. I was like this big, huge fan that was just obsessed about everything about the Muppets. How were they performed, and how were they built and constructed, and how did they design them, and how did they make the shows, and how did they put a show together? How did they tape it? I mean, just everything about it I wanted to know. I couldn't get enough of it. So to be able to actually walk into the actual studio and watch them do all this and see how they would put a song together and sketches, and see how the sets were built, and to walk into the workshop and put on Muppets and all that kind of thing, and then hang out with the puppeteers, of course, in the workshop a little bit and chat with them was amazing. I mean, it was just incredible for an obsessive Muppet fan like myself. And I'd also bring in puppets that I'd built into the studio, into the workshop, basically, and show the puppet builders. And every once in a while, Jim Henson would put on the puppets I'd built and do voices with them and sort of play with them and encourage me, really. Even though he was like super busy, as you can imagine, he still sort of found time to encourage me and and show me that kindness. So it really was a magical, amazing, crazy time. But I was, of course, absorbing everything and soaking it all in like a sponge, and watching them build these puppets, and they all got to know me, really, and I was sort of a regular fixture in that last sort of 6 months of the final series, really, which was 1980, the first 6 months of 1980.
Most people tend to build up to meeting the industry experts, but you seem to have met him quite early on.
Yeah. So that was, I was still 15 at that point in time, and I was still at school, of course. So that was kind of like my what I called my work experience. And yeah, but I knew what I wanted to do at that point in time, and there was nowhere else for me to go to really learn that stuff. It was a new thing, really. That style of puppetry was still relatively new. There was nowhere to go to learn it other than self-teach and or learn from those guys. So it was really the only logical conclusion to me, and somehow conveniently being, a half-hour bus ride from the studio sort of just made it all magically happen, I suppose. It was interesting and weird, and the connections that sort of led to that happening at that age. But I guess it was meant to be. You could sort of, if you wanted to be really corny about it, you could say that was, part of the rainbow connection.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So was it the Great Muppet Caper next?
Yeah, that was my very first job. So the Muppet Show finished taping about the same time I finished school, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to build puppets, I wanted to perform puppets, and that was going to be my life. Nothing else was acceptable. So I just turned 16 in the summer holidays, and I'd left school. In the UK, of course, you could do that at 16 and not get arrested. So I did that, and they literally went across the street to the film studios, Elstree, what was then, I think, EMI Film Studios, and started work on the Great Muppet Caper. So what I did was they were on location first, in fact, and I tracked them down to where they were filming, and it was out in a place called Haddenham Village. I think it might have been Hertfordshire somewhere, but it was Haddenham Village, and that's where they were shooting the scene with Robert Morley when they fall out of the sky in the crates and land in the duck pond. So, yeah, they were filming that, and I finally got there after a series of coaches and buses and arrived about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and watched the last sort of hour or so of filming. And then they came to the end, and it was actually Jim Henson's 44th birthday, and everybody was giving him birthday cards and stuff like that. And I had prepared an envelope which had a letter asking for a job as a puppeteer, and I had pictures in there of puppets that I'd built, and there was a little newspaper article that I'd been in a local paper, and that was all in there. So he, I think, thought it was a birthday card, and basically said, "Oh, thank you very much," and that was that. And so I went back to the bus stop and waited forever for the country bus to arrive as all the big limos and unit production vans went speeding past. And about 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from David Laser, the executive producer, saying, would you like to do some background puppeteering work on the film? And within a week or two, I was on set working my first Muppet and doing night shoots. And I was really I think they just took me on initially for that 1 week, but it just sort of kept extending, and I never really ever auditioned, which was weird. It just kind of rolled on from one thing to the next. And before I knew it, I was assisting Jim and assisting Frank with Kermit, Piggy, and Fozzie, and doing background characters, doubling up for principal characters as well. At the same time, they were building for the Dark Crystal at the Hampstead Workshop. And Bobby Payne, who was, he remembered me coming by the Muppet Show workshop when he was building some puppets for that final season. He was heading up the Podling and Slave department for the Dark Crystal, and there were about 100 puppets to build. And he remembered that I did that and knew that I was around now on Muppets. So basically, when I wasn't on set filming the Great Muppet Caper, I'd go to Hampstead to the workshop, and I'd work under him constructing these puppets for the Dark Crystal. So that kind of segued into that, basically. It was quite an amazing, wonderful creative time and a wonderful time for learning so much.
Did you design the podlings?
Not at all. Yeah, no, I was literally, I mean, they're all designed by Brian Froud and then sculpted by just maybe 2 or 3 different people. And then they had someone who did the costume, constructed the costumes, another couple of people who sort of did the painting and makeup on them. Someone else made the eyeballs and someone else did hair and stuff like that. So essentially, and I think there are about 5 different bodies for patterns for different body shapes and types and ages and that kind of thing. So they're all, everything was pretty well established by the time I got there. But then came the job of just constructing them all the limbs and skulls and mouth interiors. I sort of sometimes did my own thing with the mouth interiors to make them all nice and flexible and the grips inside and that kind of thing. So I suppose I had a little bit of flexibility in that sort of stuff. But yeah, it was great.
Who did you perform on the Dark Crystal?
My principal character was the slave master, the later called Skeknar, so one of the Skeksis. And he was the one with he had a hook and an eye patch and had all this leather and studs, and he'd sort of kick the slaves up the bum and try and herd them around to get them to go where they needed to be. So he was sort of one of the secondary Skeksis, but I ended up with that role. I think Kathy Mullen was originally going to be a Skeksis, and she was doing Kira, and I think she decided that it was going to be too much doing that and a Skeksis at the same time. So she, I think, pulled out from doing that ahead of production. And I guess Jim thought, well, let's try Michael on this. So that was Jim, it was all Jim. And before I knew it, I was a Skeksis. So I also helped Jim a few times with Jan, and I helped Kira a lot more. I think I was Kira's, what would I be, right hand a lot of the time. Some of the environmental creatures and that sort of thing as well. So I was around the film doing one thing and another, and then one of the arms on the Urskeks at the end as well, performing one of those with the mechanical hand and everything. So yeah, I was around almost the entire film, actually performing, going from one scene to another and from one creature to another. Yeah, so great. I mean, this was the thing, though. This was the first fully animatronic film, essentially, and really there hadn't really been any animatronic live-action hand puppets before then, other than Yoda in Empire Strikes Back. So this was even before E.T. or anything else. So we, had to figure out what in the world were we doing? How do we do this? Can we do this? How do we make them walk realistically and not be Muppet-like? And how do we work the faces in a realistic way? How do they blink naturally? And when do the eyes turn? And how do you do all that to pull it all together? And it was a first, really. Pretty well invented the animatronic hand puppet, essentially.
I've spoken to quite a few Dark Crystal performers over the years, like Kiran Shah, who played live-action Jen, and Hugh Spite as well. And everyone has commented on the level of detail that everything had. So things like little tiny moving plants and little interactive environments, it looked like a real world.
Yeah, that's the thing. Everything was performed real time in camera too, which was amazing. And we did a lot of rehearsals, a lot of film tests, I remember, where they would so we could sort of get used to performing more realistically on the big screen. So a lot of movements had to be scaled way down, and we had to learn to perform things really smoothly and really naturally. I mean, yeah, they were sculpted with a lot of detail and painted with detail. And it wasn't until seeing I think the Blu-ray disc. I haven't seen the 4K yet, so who knows what that'll be like. But when I finally saw the Blu-ray a few years ago, it was just amazing because for the first time to me, it just looked like being back on set again. It was like just stepping into that world all those years ago, all those decades ago now. And yeah, so I was really pleased with the Blu-ray. I thought the colors and the detail were amazing. So now of course, I'm going to have to buy a nice 4K setup, obviously, so I can see this thing for real now. So, but yeah, the detail was stunning and fun, I think Jim and everyone just really enjoyed creating these worlds, right down to the costumes and even the cutlery that the Skeksis were using to eat their food with. And I mean, yeah, it was just crazy the detail they went to with all that.
So next I've got that you went on to Return of the Jedi, and you had so much involvement in that. Yes,
that was basically the next film that came into Elstree Studios right after the Dark Crystal, basically, or the next big film anyway. And it was the following year. So 1980 was a great Muppet caper. 81 was The Dark Crystal, and January of 82 was The Return of the Jedi, and those films basically took up most of the studio spaces for each film. So because Jim Henson and George Lucas knew each other, of course, a whole bunch of us had pretty well been trained up in the ways of creatures and animatronic characters now for the first time ever. So we were sort of ripe for the picking, really, for Lucasfilm. So again, I never really auditioned for Return of the Jedi, strangely enough. I remember going into an office at Elstree, into Robert Watts, one of the producers, his office, and we had a chat for 10 or 15 minutes. And then that was it. A month or two later, I was brought in, and we just started rehearsing and filming, so I'd go from one character to the next. We actually started out in the first week. I was assisting Tim Rose with Cy Snootles and Admiral Akbar. So I was kind of like the assistant puppeteer for those two characters, working cables and that sort of thing for Jabba's palace. And then I worked the Reese. There was a hand puppet close-up of Reese, which sort of, I guess, looked, for want of a better description, he looks like a three-eyed camel. And then there was a full bodysuit version for wider shots, which was performed by Paul Springer. But that one didn't have any facial articulation. So then we'd go into close-ups for the hand puppet, which was all supervised by Phil Tippett and his workshop. And so, again, just because you're a puppeteer and you're not seeing and you're trained, you sort of would go from one scene to the next and from one character to the next. So I even worked a baby Ewok, as a little tiny hand puppet. So I got to do things like that. And then, of course, when Frank had his Yoda scenes, he knew that, of course, I'd right-handed for him for things like Fozzie Bear. So doing that for Yoda was pretty much the same job, essentially. I was small and didn't pull down. I knew how to perform the hand realistically and in a natural way. So he just chose me to work Yoda's right hand for him for that. So yeah, it was a wonderful, wonderful gift though. And I couldn't have done that without the experience of the Dark Crystal, of course.
And you also played a recurring character, Nien Nunb.
Yeah, that was again fortuitous. I didn't really audition for that one either. I think I sort of got myself that job in a cheeky little way. But originally he was just a background character. I call him, I describe him as just being a chorus girl at that point in time, waiting to be pulled forward. So there was just a costume version of him with just a non-articulating mask that didn't have any movement on it, basically. And so the extra would wear that. And they shot a couple of scenes already with him in the background, like in the briefing room. I think you see him. And I think there's another hangar scene where you see Nien Nunb in the background walking around with legs. So that was all before he got pulled forward. So, yeah, about halfway through the film, George Lucas, I was actually hanging out in Phil Tippett's creature workshop at Elstree, because I had nothing better to do and because they didn't tell me to go away. So I'd be playing around with puppets up there and annoying them all. And then there was these Nien Nunb masks. There were actually two of them that they'd created. And Phil was saying, oh, yeah, that guy. George just decided he wanted to use him in a scene with Lando and the Millennium Falcon. He needs a co-pilot. And George liked the look of this guy. And so he wants him to be the co-pilot with Lando, but he doesn't have any movements on his face and he's going to have dialogue. So what we're thinking of doing is perhaps putting a little sort of oxygen mask over his mouth because it doesn't move, maybe put some bladders in his cheeks, and then it looked like he's talking. And it was coming up in like a few weeks, And I thought, that really doesn't sound that exciting to me. So I sort of looked inside the head and I saw that, you could sort of move the mouth a little bit like a puppet. So I showed Phil that and I said, look, he's just sitting in the chair. Could we not turn this into a hand puppet and work it that way? And I showed him, how I was moving the mouth and stuff. And I think a light bulb went on inside Phil's head and he said, you know what? That's actually a great idea. Why don't you take one of these heads and just sort of mock it up into a hand puppet? In other words, fit it out with foam and put grips inside the mouth and stuff like that. And we'll show it to George and see what he says. So about a week later, we did a little film test with me working the hand puppet version of Nien Nunb, or my mock-up version at least. And then they also had the extra in the mask version, and they stood us next to each other, basically. And George directed a little film test directed us basically to look around and react to things and speak and all that kind of stuff. And right there and then, after probably a 2-3 minute film test, George says, "Great, how soon can you have it ready?" And essentially, because I was saying you could make that, you could put in a little eye blink mechanism on cables, and I showed how you could wiggle the ears, and he liked all that stuff, because I just put my hand behind his ear and made it wiggle. And so they said, "Okay, I think we can do it in about 2 weeks." So I said, "Great, get it done, and we'll shoot in 2 weeks." So Stuart Ziff, who was the sort of creature coordinator guy, he flew off to back to California, back to ILM with the head that I'd sort of modified, and they mechanized it out and put in the eye blinks and ear wiggles on cable controls. And 2 weeks later, we were filming, basically. And I guess because I had put that together and suggested that and done the film tests, it just meant that I'd got the job, and that was it. Because, he was always going to speak an alien language, which was always going to be replaced in post, just like with Jabba the Hutt and any other creature, So it didn't matter who was doing the voice or even what he was saying, really. So I sort of got myself the job, I think.
He's appeared in quite a few of the Star Wars films, and you've also worked yourself in different Star Wars films as well, like the sequels and the prequels.
Yeah, he wasn't in the prequels. I was always wished that he was, because at that point I wanted to perform him again. I thought, well, I'd love to do him again before it's too late or before I'm too old and can't do it, but it never really happened in the prequels. But he did appear in, in comics and books and of course, games and that kind of thing. They brought him and Admiral Akbar back as legacy characters for The Force Awakens, which was all, J.J. and Kathleen Kennedy, J.J. Abrams. So they tracked us down and brought us back in, basically, which was lovely, because they could have used anyone, to be honest. They didn't have to use ours. But it was such a nice thing, both for us and for the fans, that they honored that and gave us those opportunities to bring them back to life. It really was lovely. And so now it's been, since the Return of the Jedi to now, it's been 37 years, I think. Isn't that crazy to be, returning to a character and, that you've been doing now, albeit, intermittently, over a 37-year span?
It's great that they are recognising the original characters, though. I think that's essential.
Yeah, that's really nice. And those two are certainly, I think, Akbar and Nien Nunb seem to be sort of fan favourites, in a way, I guess, because they were both so weird and strange and in their own way, and different, that they sort of caught on, I suppose. So, yeah, it's been really great.
Well, Fraggle Rock is the next thing that I have, and Fraggle Rock to me is one of the most beautiful TV programs I've ever seen.
It's amazing, yeah, very beautifully written, sort of timeless as well. The themes are very strong. They're not talking down to kids. They're not written down to kids. They all have great songs in them, great characters, and really good life-teaching stories in them about sharing. And there's even a show about death and all kinds of things. Very intelligent series, and I think it would cost too. I mean, they say they couldn't afford to make a show like that now for children, but it was co-produced with a Canadian broadcasting company in Canada. And so all the core elements were made up there, and then we would reproduce the human bits with Sprocket and the actor in the UK and France and Germany. So we'd redo Sprocket, we'd have new actors in that language or in that accent, and then so Gobo would have to come through and collect the postcards in that set, and we'd have to match the continuity on all that and the costumes and what hand the postcard was in and that it's the correct one and what he was wearing and the speed at which he goes through the Fraggle hole. And then also some Uncle Matt sequences too. So I got to work some Uncle Matts in the UK and in France. And in Germany, I did Sprocket for, I think, 12 episodes. So the German episodes were exact carbon copies of the original Canadian Docs and Sprockets. But the French and the UK were new stories. I think in France, Sprocket was Croquette, and the human was a retired chef, pastry chef or something. So it was a totally different set, and we'd have different stories that were written specifically, and everything was performed in French. And then in the UK, of course, it was a lighthouse keeper, or rather 3 lighthouse keepers, as they switched out the actors. So, yeah.
So was it mainly Sprocket and Gobo that you helped perform on there?
Yeah, Sprocket, Gobo, and Uncle Matt, as he would do his little stories on location. And then I think we had the final episode where all the Fraggles actually came out into that world for the first time, in the last episode. So we did all that. But oftentimes we would do the same show 3 times, in different countries, which was interesting. So there was a lot of maintenance that we had to do on the puppets as well. I'd often repair and maintain and rig those main characters too over a 4 or 5 year span or whatever it was, I guess, something like that. So we had Dave Barclay was one of the main puppeteers in the UK and Europe for that, and Jeff Felix did some stuff as well. Louise Gold, I think, was involved in the first series. Kevin Bradshaw did some assisting too, and Ian Tom. So yeah, we had a whole bunch of UK puppeteers that would be a part of all that, essentially.
I think I liked it so much because it was just one of the most unique things on TV. Everything else was either cartoons or humans. You know what I mean?
That's true, and it was high quality stuff as well. I mean, such a great ensemble of puppeteers and characters and beautifully made puppets. And the main Fraggle Five was such fun, and the Doozers, and all the worlds that were created. And it was very much a product of, I think, of Jim and Michael Frith and the people close to him, around him. And it sort of embodies one of Jim's main themes, I think, which was about how we are all better together, how we, need to get along, and if we help each other, our lives are better, And so essentially that was, I think, what the show was all about. You had the Gorgs, you had the Doozers and the Fraggles, and they all sort of needed each other to complete themselves and to complete each other, And so it was a very strong sort of global lesson, I think, that we can still learn from today, Timeless, really, timeless.
Now, Labyrinth was by far the film that I rented the most from the local video shop. What was your role in Labyrinth?
Yeah, oh my goodness, Labyrinth. Yeah, so, So I was, pretty much a utility puppeteer. I actually did some, a little bit of building, construction stuff on the goblins and a bit on the fire gang. So I was rigging on set on the fire gang and doing repairs on them at night and stuff like that, and did a little bit of puppetry. I think I did some feet on those guys as they were dancing and walking across the set, puppeteered some of that stuff. Goblins, of course, lots of goblin puppetry, and I was on the cable or the radio control crew for Sir Didymus, for Dave Goals. So he had an eye patch on one eye, but his other eye and eyelid were on radio control, so I worked his eye. And then someone else did brows and the tail. I think it was Dave Goals was the main puppeteer for Didymus. I want to say maybe Dave Barclay did eyebrows, and then Dave Goals did the mouth and the left hand, and maybe Karen Prell did the right hand and the tail, possibly something like that. So Didymus was great fun though, because he was such a great character, and we had a good opportunity to rehearse him really well, maybe a week or so. So, and I remember the bridge crossing scene where we first encounter Sir Didymus, and Sarah's trying to cross the bridge, so may I cross the bridge? And he sort of run out of arguments at that point. And you see him sort of go through all these beats of this thought process. Well, and he looks down, and then he thinks, and then he looks to the side. And we got that just down, so we could just all follow each other instinctively. And we nailed the scene on film, and I'm so pleased. It's one of the few times I can say, this is where 4 of us are all just working together, and our timings are impeccable, and it just happens as one, So you watch him on that in those scenes and in the close up, and everything just happens just at the right time in such a fun, believable, realistic way. So there was that. And what else did I do? I assisted Frank Oz with the Wise Man. I think I was the left hand. Toby Philpott, I think, was the right hand. That was the one that was voiced by Michael Hordern, sitting on the books. And gosh, what else? A whole bunch of things that I've probably forgotten. Lichen eyeballs on the brick wall. Oh, the worms. I was the worm's tail as well, the little worm. So I worked the tail. Karen Prell was the main puppeteer. I think I did a little bit helping on at some point with the junk woman's hands as well in some shots. I think Cheryl Henson did some other shots with the hands, but I remember doing a little bit with that as well. So again, yeah, just did lots of different things on that film. And also the 2 music videos with David Bowie, directed by Steve Barron. And in Underground, I actually performed the junk woman where she's dancing and running down the stairs and stuff. So that was quite nice. So those are now available, I think, on YouTube and other places. Not everyone's seen those, though, but I'm sure you have, being such a big fan, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, Labyrinth was amazing. And David Bowie was, of course, real fun, really, really smart, fun guy, hardworking, an amazing man, really.
Like I said, it was the film that I rented the most in the video shop, and it's one of the films that I've got 3 times on DVD on different editions.
Yeah, and I think for Jim, it was he sort of tried to be his answer to the Dark Crystal. Where with the Dark Crystal, it was a very much a fantasy world, its own thing, and ultra realistic. It didn't do well commercially and financially, I suppose. Creatively, it was a huge success and still is a benchmark to this day. But it didn't have humans in it, and I think only 4 years later, Labyrinth was it was just literally 4 years later. We made that in 1985, and it was released, I think, in 86. But he added humans in it, and he added music and gags and stuff like that. So he tried to, I think, sort of whatever he felt maybe people thought shortcomings might have been in the Dark Crystal, then I think Labyrinth was sort of the answer to that, with the writing and bringing in Terry Jones and all the different elements. So I think that's how Labyrinth came about, I suspect.
Just going back slightly to Pseudonymous, I had no idea that it took 4 people to make him animated.
Yeah, that's it. So Dave Gold's driving the main performance, and then and one on the eyebrows on radio control, another on the eye, and then another on the other hand and the tail. I think he was mostly built by Jane Gutnick, who also built the Storyteller dog and a bunch of gonzos for many years, and she also built the trash heap in Fraggle Rock. So she was a key builder on a lot of Henson projects over the years. So I think she built him.
I bet it hits you quite hard when you're on the set of like a Jim Henson film for weeks on end, and then your job finishes and you return to reality and it's just a normal place. What's that like?
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of people don't really think about that, but rather than weeks, usually it's months, and you're all working so hard to this end goal, all sweating and working and just supporting each other for literally months and months. That is your life, and we all love it so much. And as we get close to the end of the project, we all the reality hits us that we're not going to be able to do this much longer. And I think, we tend to all be in denial a little bit. But when it does come to an end, it is always quite abrupt. And it's always been difficult for me ever since the beginning, really. When a big project comes to an end, everybody scatters to the 4 winds again, and sometimes different countries as well. And you do sort of become a tight little family where you have each other's backs, a bit like sort of being, in the trenches and in the war in some ways, because you're all sort of in there trying to win this thing together. And you do have a bond. And when it comes to an end, we're all always sort of clutching on to each other, like, emails and messages and phone calls. And every once in a while people try to meet up and stuff. But it's kind of difficult because they have, lives and families and the physical logistics of where everybody is. It's not always possible. But it's always a sad thing. And oftentimes, the other side of that is it's a wonderful thing when you come back together again on the next project. So, yeah, it's always been a hard thing to deal with. But it is also, just part of the job. And as I think one of Jim Henson's characters, was it in Fraggle Rock, maybe? He said that, life is a series of meetings and partings. But hopefully we go away being more enriched from having had that experience with each other, You leave a little part of yourself with someone else. and you take a little part of someone else with you as you move on. So that's a nice way to look at it.
Like I said, my favourite film was Labyrinth, but one film I wasn't allowed to rent from the video shop was Little Shop of Horrors because it had the word horror in it. And my mum didn't like horror, so I wasn't allowed to borrow that one. So I only got to see that towards the end of the 80s.
Finally, right? Well, it was a Little Shop of Horrors. It wasn't a big shop of horrors. I mean, if it was a big shop of horrors, I can understand it. But it was just a little shop, a little corner shop, innocent, That's so funny. I mean, I guess it was potentially a little bit scary, although not as scary as it originally would have been, where, it was a little bit more graphic and you saw Steve Martin's head being fed to the plant and things like that, and they all died at the end originally. So yeah, that was, I think, 1986, I believe, is when we filmed that at Pinewood. At the same time they were filming Aliens, the second Alien film. So yeah, they were the two big pictures in that studio at that same time there. So yeah, very, very hard physically. We rehearsed for months and months. I was one of the lip sync puppeteers on the plants. So we had two teams. One team was Mac Wilson and Rob Tigner, one on each lip, and then the other team was Dave Barkley and myself. And so we'd sort of tag back and forth, because it was sort of too much for just, between rehearsals and then filming and the different size plants and things. So we had to have two teams, as well as a few vines and things like that. But it looks good now. I can finally appreciate the film now for how I should. I guess I didn't. All I remembered when it came out was just the pain in my arms and the suffering and how cold it was and how difficult it was and how we had to work 6 days a week and long days and in a darkened pit, but suddenly now with all this distance, I really appreciate what, the great work that Frank Oz did as a director, and how he really crafted that film in such a beautiful way and put it together, and the amazing performances from all the cast as well. Incredible work, actually, and again, quite timeless. And I remember at the time, 86, we knew CG was coming. We knew it was on its way. And I remember at the time thinking, we're pulling these cables saying, when is CG going to come along? Because this would be so much easier being done as a CG plant instead of the real thing, But of course, how wrong could I be? Because there's nothing like seeing the real thing. I mean, yeah, it was super expensive and super hard, but my goodness, it was all real in camera, and when that plant singing Feed Me, when that mouth closes, it blows air through that you can see wafting on Rick Moranis's hair and clothes and stuff. I mean, he's performing, albeit at 16 frames per second instead of 24. We had to slow everything down a little bit because the inertia of all that rubber and fiberglass and stuff we just couldn't move it physically quick enough to get the lip sync and the moves. So we had to shoot at slower speeds. So Rick had to perform at slower speeds for the songs. But it's real, it's all in camera. It's amazing, crazy, insane.
I only found out that it was filmed at 16 frames per second, I think last year when I got the Blu-ray with the special edition extras on it. And that was such a good insight into that film.
Yeah. And in fact, and then when we went to the larger plant for Mean Green Mother and the other stuff in the lead up to that, because he was bigger again, we had to shoot that at half speed at 12 frames per second. So, of course, everything took twice as long to film then as well. But anyway, so it's the only way we could just physically get the stuff to work. It's by that time he was the size of a Volkswagen car. Crazy stuff, all designed and built by Lyle Conway, of course. And then under him was Neil Scanlon, who also worked on animatronics on Labyrinth and on Dream Child, which doesn't really get talked about very much. But Neil Scanlon, as we know, went on to become the creature supervisor on the new Star Wars films. But Neil and I actually go back to, I think, Dream Child, in fact, where he was working under Lyle Conway on that project. I assume you've seen Dream Child, right?
I don't know, actually. I know the name. I can't picture it, though.
Yeah, so that was a Dennis Potter film, a super low budget, but it had Coral Brown as the main character, who was Vincent Price's wife, and a few other actors. Ian Holm played Lewis Carroll. but it was essentially the story of the real Alice in Wonderland, Alice Liddell, as an old woman basically going to New York to get an honor, basically an accolade. And so she sort of hallucinates about sort of going in and out of her childhood and in and out of the book. So she's in a room and she opens a door and suddenly she's in the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, and all the animatronics kind of look a lot more like the original Tenniel drawings from the original books. And so they're all very menacing and gnarly and nasty and scary, basically. So that was, I think we filmed that in 1983. And the producer of that was Rick McCallum, who then went on, of course, to produce the prequels, Star Wars films for George Lucas. So, if you ever get a chance to see that, I know it's on DVD now. It's actually a lovely little film. It was made super cheap. Oh, Fulton Mackay did a voice for, was it the Griffin or one of those characters, who, of course, played the lighthouse keeper in Fraggle Rock in the first, I think, 2 seasons, I think it was. It's all connected up. But if you haven't seen it, and anyone listening, then I would recommend trying to get a copy of the DVD, the widescreen DVD, which finally came out, because it's a lovely film and very, very Dennis Potter. But it's great fun.
Now, something that I didn't know until very, very recently is that he also worked on Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Yes, I was one of the, pretty well the chief sort of hand puppeteer. So there were a lot of, we all worked under George Gibbs, the special effects guy, he actually, won the Oscar for best special effects that year. So we sort of were under him, basically. But Dave Barclay sort of was brought in to supervise the puppet side of things, and then they brought me in as the hand puppeteer guy. So a lot of our solutions were pretty simple. We had wire rigs and rodded rigs with guns on the end and things like that, and strings, marionettes, and all kinds of stuff like that. So essentially, we would move the props around, and they would draw the cartoons around what we did, the tunes, I should say, around what we performed. So we'd work very closely with Richard, the animation supervisor there, and the ILM guys as well that would render props and that sort of thing. Don Hahn and who was the ILM visual effects guy? He was like Bob Zemeckis' main guy for a while. Ken Ralston, that's it. There we go. I knew I'd get there eventually. So we worked very closely with all those guys so that we all knew we were all on the same page, So we'd do things like the octopus bartender, and of course all the things the octopus were working were just pouring a whiskey shot in a glass. That was all real, and I had the cocktail shaker that he was shaking, and that was all real in camera. So each tentacle was working something, and then they'd draw the cartoon around that. And the penguin waiter trays. So I did some hand puppetry stuff where they would draw a weasel around my hand, essentially. So I'd stick my hand up like a hand puppet. So like when Judge Doom throws the record across the room and a weasel catches it in his mouth, that's me hand puppeteering the weasel with the record in my mouth. And then the same with in Eddie Valiant's office. There's a weasel that's got a bar of soap in his mouth, and he's sort of blowing soap bubbles out. That's me puppeteering that as well as a hand puppet. And then when Roger's jumping up and down on the bed, I'm underneath the bed, pulling little sort of footsteps under there, footprints and stuff on little rigs. So we did all that kind of stuff, and lots of guns on rods. Loads and loads of things. Some things that were cut as well. There was one point when we filmed this, I think, as well, actually, where Roger in the bar. I don't even remember. There was a character who had a notepad, and that was actually performed by Paul Springer, who was in fact the Reese performer in Return of the Jedi that I mentioned earlier. So he was acting in that, and Roger Rabbit in the film grabs his notepad and pencil and starts sketching out a shape. And he flips a page, sketches another shape, and keeps going, gets quicker and quicker and quicker until it becomes an animated sequence, essentially. And so they were going to draw around my hand. I basically performed that hand, and then they were going to draw Roger's hand over mine, rendering this sketch. But that got cut. And there was one time where I was Jessica Rabbit's hands as well. It's right when, again, it was a scene that was cut, and I don't think they ever finished it. But it's when Bob Hoskins comes back from Toontown with the pig head on him, and he goes into the shower, and showers the pig head off. You sort of see the shadow behind the curtain. In the final movie, you just sort of hear a toilet flush, and then he comes out of the bathroom and sees Jessica Rabbit out there in his office, But what we actually filmed was he gets soap in his eyes, and his hand kind of comes out from around the shower curtain, fumbling for the towel. And Jessica Rabbit's already in there, and she hands him the towel. And so that was me actually using my hands as hers to hand him the towel. And that's how the scene was going to play out. But they just cut that whole part out. So yeah, Bob Zemeckis was just amazing, seeing how he worked with all the departments, with the actors and the effects staff. And, he had a great camera crew with him, of course. He had his main Roger Rabbit guys that he was using as DP and camera operators and stuff. So he hadn't quite done Back to the Future 2 and 3 yet. I think he was going to go back and do those after Roger Rabbit. So he'd already done the first movie. But, I was so impressed with him. I just love him as a director. He's just done so many wonderful films. He really has.
I'd love to watch Who Framed Roger Rabbit without the animation on top.
Oh, yeah. And they have a version of that somewhere, I'm sure, in their archives. Because, of course, we shot everything twice, basically. Once without anything, with just the backgrounds, of course. They had the robotic tracks and cameras. And then with us in there with rods and arms and that kind of thing, and strings, and then performing basically against pretty much nothing, so that probably does exist in some sort of form or other. That would be weird, wouldn't it? I know we've seen clips, haven't we? But we haven't really seen the whole thing.
If you had a side-by-side comparison of the full film, with and without animation, that would be brilliant.
Wouldn't it? Yeah. All the rigs and stuff. Yeah, wow.
Now, I know you go to a lot of conventions and Comic-Cons, because that's where I met you originally.
Yeah.
Do you do quite a few a year?
Yeah, it comes and goes. I think there's been some years where I've really only just done one or two, or barely that, and then there's others where it seems like I've done 10 or 15. So it completely is so random. I think it also depends on where I am and what I'm doing at the time. What work is happening, what filming is going on. That often dictates. Like I was in the UK doing filming and stuff. So then of course it meant doing a bit more, more UK and European conventions and that kind of thing. But I do enjoy it, and to me it's sort of all part of the same job in a way, because I actually get feedback from people, and the feedback they give me sort of goes back into the work that I do in a way, so it sort of completes that cycle a little bit. So because normally you work on a film, especially back in the day before social media, you worked on stuff and it was a bit like working in a black hole, really. You just did it, moved on, and hoped it was okay, but now everything's a lot more open. And when I hear that people like a certain thing, that it's caught on, then I'll try and put some of that stuff back into what I do. It's like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that was a thing, so now I'm going to try and do that. So it's actually a good thing, and it also, what I like about the conventions, and this is me, I think, more speaking from as a fan from that point of view, because as a kid I used to collect autographs too, you see, when I was little, and even now I'll get in line, and as long as I've got time, I'll if there's someone I really admire, I'll swap autographs with, or try and meet them and have a chat with them, because I appreciate their work and I'm a fan as well. So there's something nice about I think being able to what I call connecting the dots between you sitting in that theater and seeing this magical stuff flicker on the silver screen in another world, and another time, and another place, another galaxy. And yet it seems like it's just so far removed from reality. Yet when you can meet someone who is actually part of that, it sort of connects it, it brings it closer to home. You think, okay, maybe I could do this, or these are real people after all. And there's something nice about that, I think, both for the fans and hopefully the people that worked on the projects as well. It's nice just to connect that stuff up and make it more real for everybody,
You've also had a successful book funded recently, which is a printed book and an audio book.
Oh, yes. Yeah, exactly. Yes. So I'm writing it as we speak. Yes. So it was on Kickstarter, and I was going to wait a little bit longer. I thought, well, I haven't really done my big thing yet, so I'll wait until that happens. But then people kept saying, I want to hear about your work and Jim Henson and all this stuff. And I thought, well, I've almost got 40 years worth now of work. So maybe I ought to do this while I still can, and while I can still remember. So I decided to go ahead and just do a sort of a very limited first edition that would be signed, hard copy and hardback and softback. And each of those I'll actually sign and send out from me directly. There's a small number, basically, just the people that bought it, basically, and that'll be a first edition. And then, yes, there'll be an audio book that I'll read myself as well. And it's nice for me to sort of piece all that back together again as well. And I remember things that I'd forgotten too, which is quite nice. So people want to hear about that. They want to hear about Storyteller and the films and the little stories behind the stories and just how things came about. How on earth did I get from being, a nobody kid basically in North London, to doing all this stuff? How does that work? How does that happen? So that's sort of really, why I'm doing it now. But yes, so it's called Talk to the Hand, at least at the moment. It probably will remain that, I suppose. And so that'll be the first edition.
Will it be available afterwards as well?
Yeah, at that point, it'll probably be a second edition. So the first edition remains unique and, fancy. And then there'll be a second edition that will come out later that will probably be somewhat modified. It might have some stuff added to it later as well, of course. But it probably won't be quite as fancy visually or physically, I should say. And they won't be, signed, because there'll be things like print on demand and that kind of thing. Nevertheless, people that couldn't get in on it now or just aren't ready to, they'll be able to find it a lot easier later on online, and a lot cheaper too, for that matter. But it will be a second edition, and they won't be signed or anything like that.
And you also teach puppetry online as well, on online courses.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's been open about a year maybe or so now. It's called Secrets of Puppetry. And so people can go to academy.secretsofpuppetry.com or sometimes just secretsofpuppetry.com, and I'll have a special going on where they can get in there for a bit less. But really, it's an online video academy, which is basically containing all the things that I wish that I'd had when I was starting out. There wasn't anything that existed back when I was beginning. I sort of had to teach myself and learn, in the field under the best people in the world. But of course, not everyone has that opportunity. So I took all the elements of what Jim and Frank and Richard Hunt and Dave Giles and all those guys taught us in things like puppeteering workshops on Dark Crystal, and all the things that I'd learned along the way myself that apply to specifically technique, essentially. Muppet and puppetry and film and TV puppetry techniques, how to stand, what is lip sync exactly, and what does that mean, and how does it break down, how do the bones in your arms work and not work, and how do you get around that, how do you do rods, how do you do right hands, how do you do less, how do you do nothing and still keep the puppet alive? I mean, all this stuff, it just goes on and on. But everything's broken down from day one. So if you're just starting out and you've never put a puppet on before, you can still do this. And it just builds up with layering on technique and using monitors and eye focus, and just, it's all technique basically. But if people were to go through this, and spend months going over the lessons and really refining the technique, there's no reason why they couldn't be, the same as anyone else who's out there getting paid doing it right now. I'd say, within so many months, you could sort of get to a certain level, to be honest. So it's, it's time for that information to get out there and to encourage new blood and new puppeteers, and, people bring new ideas onto the scene as well. And there's always room for new puppeteers and new puppets, new characters, new ideas. I don't think we'll ever run out of space for that, to be honest. So bring it on, So I want to encourage new puppeteers to come onto the scene and do their thing, basically, whether it's local or live or just for fun as a hobby or a professional career. Come in there and learn and do your thing, basically. And then if they do well, then they can employ me, can't they?
Oh, it's a self-serving thing, isn't it? I like that idea.
That's rather good, isn't it? Yeah, right. Yeah, it's sort of a sharing, giving mentality, though. I think everybody wins in the end. And it's just not right for this stuff to be kept a secret or to be lost in the sands of time in a way, I think this stuff should be shared if people want it.
And where else can we find you online? Are you on Facebook or Instagram, Twitter?
Got a Secrets of Puppetry Instagram. They can find me there. And then just Mike Quinn. They can find me on Facebook. I do have Twitter as well, but I tend not to really use it that much at the moment. But I am apparently there somewhere. So I'm quite easy to find, actually, if people need, and happy to help people if they're looking for any advice in puppetry or things related to that in their career and all that. So, yeah, absolutely. And usually I'll post on there if I'm appearing at any upcoming conventions and shows, all that type of thing. They can find me pretty easily, I think.